It was supposed to be a private message, a quick Slack DM from our new chief product officer to her team. But instead, she posted it in the general engineering channel. Everyone saw it. We need to purge Eliza. She's legacy baggage. No context, no explanation. Just that 6 cold words that felt like a slap in the face. I was sitting right there, watching the screen, watching the reactions, watching the silence settle like dust after an explosion. A few engineers sent confused emojis. One person quietly left the channel. No one tagged me, no one said my name, but they didn't have to. Because I was Eliza, and I wasn't legacy. I was the architecture, the reason the system didn't collapse last year when everything else did. I built it from a couch in a 1-bedroom apartment, sleeping 4 hours a night and debugging through panic attacks. I gave everything, and now I was disposable baggage. That word clung to me like smoke. Ugly, dismissive, final. And yet, I didn't say a word, not then, not in the chat, not even out loud, because if there's one thing I've learned in tech, silence is powerful, especially when you have receipts. But before I tell you what happened after that message, where are you tuning in from? And tell me, have you ever been pushed aside by someone who didn't even understand what you built? Drop a comment if this hits close to home. You never know who needs to read your story. Back then, it was just me, an old laptop, and an attic that couldn't hold heat in the winter. Tulsa was cheap. That's why I moved there. Rent was $400 a month. I worked out of a creaky attic room with no insulation, a leaky window, and a space heater that sounded like a dying lawnmower. The kind that shuts off randomly and needs a kick to start again. I built the first lines of the pulse point system with gloves on, typing through fingerless wool and breath clouds. At the time, no one believed in me. My ex said I should get a stable job. My dad thought I was wasting my degree. And I'll be honest, some nights I believed them. Nights when the code wouldn't compile, when my bank account dipped below $50, when dinner was instant oatmeal with hot sauce because that's all I had. But every time I hit a breakthrough, when the system finally processed that first data batch correctly, I felt something shift. Like I was building a skeleton for something real, something bigger than me. So when the co-founders of PulsePoint AI asked me to come on board as a technical consultant, I said yes, but with terms. I'd license my core architecture to the company, but not hand it over. Quarterly renewals, my LLC. My signature on every module. They didn't care. Back then, I was the only one who could make it work, and they needed me more than I needed them. The company grew. We moved from Tulsa to Austin. Got funding. Hired fast. Glossy new hires with MacBooks and buzzwords. But the core, that was still mine. What they didn't know, or didn't bother to ask, was how much of the system still depended on what I built in that freezing attic. And one day, they'd find out. The hard way. Becca Sloan arrived on a Tuesday morning with a chai latte in one hand and a ring light in the other. She didn't introduce herself at first, just started filming a team culture video in the hallway outside engineering. "We're building the future of healthcare," she whispered to her phone, as if the camera would fall in love with her passion. Later that day, she was formally introduced as our new Chief Product Officer, brought in by the investors after a successful funding round. Her resume, half Silicon Valley buzzwords, half Instagram reels of her speaking at conferences in blazers too tight to breathe in. During her welcome meeting, she smiled like a TED Talk, using words like velocity hygiene and synergizing the AI stack. I watched the new hires nod along like they understood. I watched the older engineers stare blankly, fingers paused mid-type. Becca wasn't here to understand what we had. She was here to scale it. She started making changes fast, renaming internal systems, dissolving sprint rituals, flattening the team hierarchy by removing anyone with context. Overnight, people who'd been there since the Tulsa days were reassigned, demoted, or let go. No transition plans, no handoffs, just gone. When someone quietly asked in a stand-up if we could keep the old triage system for a bit longer, Becca replied without looking up, "We're not here to preserve sentiment. We're here to move." The room went quiet. I stayed silent too, watching, logging, remembering. I knew this game. I'd seen it before. The consultant who believes history slows progress, who strips out what works because it isn't flashy, who values momentum over memory. And I knew what came next, because when someone builds on ground they don't bother to study, they're always surprised when it collapses under their feet. But the ground? It was still mine, and they'd forgotten that. Until it reminded them. It didn't happen all at once. That would have been easier to fight. First, my tasks disappeared from the board. No Jira tickets, no sprint assignments, just blank space where my name used to be. Then came the calendar changes. Meetings vanished, stand-ups, retros, planning sessions. At first, I thought it was a bug. I even restarted my laptop twice before I realized it wasn't tech. It was intentional. By Friday, my access to the codebase was read-only. The backend branch I'd created 4 years ago, the one labeled Pulse Core Root, was locked. I couldn't push, I couldn't pull, I couldn't even comment. The DevOps channel I founded, archived. The internal wiki with my documentation, edited, republished, and scrubbed of my name. No one said anything. No email, no message, not even a quiet, awkward hallway conversation. I'd been erased, like a typo. I started showing up earlier, staying later. Sitting at the same desk I'd claimed since we moved into the Austin office, now shoved next to the printer like I was part of the furniture. People nodded at me in passing, but the conversations always died when I got too close. It was like being in a room with noise-canceling walls. I was present, but never invited. One afternoon, I tried to join a dev sync I used to lead. The Zoom room asked for a passcode. I didn't have it. That night, I sat in the break room with a stale granola bar and watched Becca walk past, laughing into her AirPods. She didn't glance my way. I doubt she even remembered I was still on payroll. But I wasn't surprised. This is how it works in tech, when they want you gone without the risk of you making noise. They don't fire you. They phase you out, quietly, systematically, like you were never there to begin with. But here's the thing. When you're on the outside looking in, you start to see everything they don't want you to, and I was watching. It was a Sunday evening, the kind where time moves slower and your mind won't stop rewinding. I was sitting on the floor of my apartment, sorting through old files, not digital ones, the paper kind. A shoebox full of contracts, scribbled notes, receipts, backup drives with handwritten labels. I hadn't looked at them in years. And then I saw it. The original consulting agreement from PulsePoint's early days. My name at the top, their logo back when it was still pixelated and misspelled. It smelled like dust and peppermint tea, the scent of my hustle. I flipped through the pages, half out of nostalgia, half out of a need to remind myself that I had been part of something real. Then I found it. Clause 9.3, Intellectual Property Licensing Terms. All proprietary components authored by consultant remain under the ownership of Eliza Hart LLC. Usage is granted via quarterly renewable license. Ownership is non-transferable without written consent. My chest tightened, not in panic, in clarity. They forgot. They had removed me, erased me, dismissed me, but they'd never renewed the license. No formal notice, no paperwork. Nothing, which meant they were still using my system, my modules, my code without legal permission. I read the clause again and again just to be sure I wasn't projecting, but the language was airtight. My lawyer back then made sure of it. While they were busy designing pitch decks and filming launch teasers, I was still the quiet owner of the engine running beneath it all. I closed the binder, stood up slowly, and walked to my desk. There was no rage, no triumph, just a quiet, grounded certainty. They thought they'd locked me out, but they never checked the foundation. And now I had something they didn't expect: leverage. The kind you don't use in anger, the kind you save until the moment it matters most. They called it a quick check-in. HR meetings always come wrapped in soft language like that. Polite, padded, pre-chewed. I walked into the glass-walled room they called the reflection space. A peace lily in the corner, a bowl of peppermint candies on the table. Corporate serenity. Kara from People Operations was already waiting, clipboard in hand, smiled too wide to be genuine. "Thanks for coming in, Eliza," she said, like this wasn't rehearsed. "We just wanted to touch base and make sure you're feeling supported during this transition period." I didn't respond. I just sat. She slid a folder across the table. Manila. Neat. One paperclip holding everything in place. "We've put together a transition package," she said, folding her hands like she was presenting a birthday gift. 6 weeks of severance, optional career coaching, and we'd love to include a LinkedIn recommendation if that's helpful. I opened the folder. 10 pages. Double-spaced, all in that same HR-friendly font, the one that tries too hard not to look threatening. Most of it was standard. Severance details, NDA reminders, exit protocol. Until I got to Section 7. Employee acknowledges that all contributions, code and intellectual property associated with the PulsePoint platform are owned solely by PulsePoint AI Inc. I looked up slowly. "You want me to sign this?" Kara blinked, then gave a light laugh. It's just standard language. "Legal boilerplate. Everyone signs it." I didn't blank. "I didn't write boiler code," I said, "and I don't sign boiler contracts." She froze. Smile faltered just slightly. I clicked my pen, drew a single line through the paragraph, and wrote in clean cursive, "IP licensing exclusion, retained per clause 9.3 of original consulting agreement." Initialed it, closed the folder. "I'll wait while legal reviews," I added. Kara didn't know what to say. Because this wasn't just about paper. This was about memory and ownership and people who assumed silence meant surrender. I walked out without looking back. They thought I was agreeing to fade quietly. They didn't realize I'd just set the terms. The day I left, no one said goodbye. There was no farewell lunch, no Slack message, no "we'll miss you" card signed with half-hearted emojis. Just a hallway of averted eyes and keyboards clicking slightly too loud. I packed my desk slowly, not because I had a lot to take. Most of my things had already been erased. But I took what mattered. A worn notebook with old sketches of system architecture, my favorite mug, chipped at the handle, and a flash drive labeled V1 Pulse Route. The knitting needles I used to bring, in the ones Becca once mocked in front of the interns, went into the canvas bag last. Nobody stopped me. Nobody even looked up. I walked past the meeting room's glass boxes filled with buzzwords and borrowed confidence, and pushed through the front door like a ghost leaving the scene of a crime no one realized had happened yet. Outside, the sun felt sharp, too bright for a day like this. But I didn't feel defeated. I felt clean. Because this wasn't failure. This wasn't exile. This was strategy. They thought I was retreating. What I was actually doing was removing myself from the blast radius. Back at my apartment, I plugged in my personal server, pulled up the access logs, quietly reactivated the license tracker, updated the IP monitoring script. Then I brewed tea, opened my laptop, and got to work. I didn't need their stage. I had the blueprint. I didn't need their approval. I had the contract. I didn't need to fight for space. I had leverage. Let them celebrate. Let them believe the silence meant I was gone. Because sometimes the loudest part of the story happens long after the door closes. And the first sign was just a message. One quiet Slack ping from someone who finally noticed something was missing. But not yet. Not quite. Soon. It started small. It always does. A developer named Aiden, fresh out of boot camp, 3 weeks on the job, opened a ticket about a failed staging deployment, CI pipeline error, missing credentials for container registry. At first, they assumed it was a permission issue. Someone forgot to update a token. Happens all the time, right? Except the fallback didn't work either, and neither did the manual override. By noon, 2 engineers were digging through the documentation. Becca stormed into their workspace with a smoothie in hand and asked, "Where's the deployment key? Just push through it." One of the devs looked up. "We're trying, but we can't find the latest schema." Becca frowned. "Didn't Eliza document that?" The room went quiet. Nobody answered. Nobody had to. That night, Jonah, the only dev who'd been there since Tulsa, stayed late. He opened a service orchestration file that hadn't been touched in months. Inside was a line of code that read, "Import Eliza root.trigger kappa." His eyebrows knit. He searched the internal repo. Nothing came up. Then he checked the logs. That function had been called over 400 times, and every time it silently authorized deployments, validated build config, and handled container rollback during CI failures. And now it was unreachable. He posted in the hashtag infra support channel. "Anyone know where this dependency lives? Getting unresolved import on Eliza root." No reply. Just an eye emoji from a junior dev and a DM that read, "Thought that was deprecated." It wasn't. By the next morning, authentication was failing in the staging environment. The autoscaler was stalling. Payment logs stopped syncing correctly, and Becca, she was too busy prepping the investor demo to notice the system was blinking red from the inside out, until Jonah walked into her office pale, tired, holding a printed screenshot of the error log. She looked up. "What is it?" He set the paper down and said, just one line, "We need to talk about Eliza's code." And that was just the beginning. I didn't send it with any dramatic subject line, no bold warnings, no legal threats, just a simple email from billing@elizahart.dev to accounting@pulsepointai.com. Subject, Q1 usage report, IP license tracking, attachment, Hart_LLC_license log Q1. Inside was a neat little spreadsheet. Timestamps, module names, environment breakdown, dev, staging, production, total API pings, calculated usage hours, and one final line. Amount due, $148, $250, due date, net 7, remit to Eliza Hart, LLC. I didn't write a message. I didn't need to. 2 hours later, the email was flagged by their accounting intern as possibly spam. 3 hours after that, someone in finance actually opened the CSV, and then the real emails started, first to Becca, then to legal, then to engineering. Panic doesn't announce itself. It builds slowly in the way people stop replying, in the way calendar invites start stacking up, in the way Becca's hallway strides turn from confident to clipped. Later that afternoon, she stormed into a meeting with Jonah, holding a printed copy of the invoice. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "We've moved off her code." Jonah looked at her, calm, tired. "No, we haven't. You just renamed the folders." She froze. "You're telling me this is legit?" she asked. He didn't flinch. "I'm telling you, we've been running on her infrastructure since day one." There was a long pause. Then Becca dropped the invoice on the table like it burned. "It's extortion." Jonah shook his head. "It's accounting." Back at my apartment, I was sipping tea and watching the IP tracker bot do its job, logging every hit from their servers, packaging it into tidy monthly invoices. No threats, no push, just the rhythm of what was earned, what was used, and what was owed. The next invoice would be larger. And this time, they couldn't pretend not to see it, because someone else had already seen it first, and he was about to say something that couldn't be ignored. The email thread had grown to over 20 replies. Legal, accounting, product, engineering. Each new message more urgent, more careful, more vague. At first, they called it an unexpected licensing discrepancy. Then it became a possible documentation oversight. But by the end of the day, they had no choice but to call it what it was. Jonah sent the final message that broke the polite silence. Attached are 2 screenshots, one from the live codebase showing active calls to Eliza Hart's proprietary modules, and one from the deployment logs recorded during the demo stream, time-stamped, verified, cross-referenced. Then, in a single line, We are currently operating on unlicensed code. That was when the real reckoning began. The CFO forwarded the message to the board with a subject line that simply read, "Urgent IP violation, potential liability." The general counsel responded with 2 words, "This tracks." They had known about Clause 9.3. It was in the original consulting agreement, the one Becca had skimmed, initialed, and slid across the table months ago without a second glance. And now every system they were demoing, every client they'd pitched, every investor deck they'd posted online was built on software they no longer had the right to use. The silence in the executive channel was louder than any shouting. Until Bryce, the lead counsel, said what no one else wanted to write, "This isn't a clerical error. This is theft, and theft has consequences." The founder called for an emergency board meeting. The CFO prepped a financial damage estimate. Becca, she was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, back in my small apartment, I sat by the window with my laptop open, in a quiet screen blinking in soft gray. The next invoice was already drafted. The late fee line had been added. And below it, a reminder in plain font, per contract terms, retroactive licensing fees apply. They could still pretend they hadn't known, but now they couldn't pretend they hadn't been told. And in the next room, the boardroom doors were about to open for someone's final meeting. The boardroom looked like it had been frozen mid-smile. Whiteboards still full of launch metrics, coffee half drunk, an investor pitch slide paused on a screen behind Becca, all caps, AI reimagined, built from the ground up. The irony almost made me laugh. Becca walked in 10 minutes late, still in her signature white sneakers, blazer, sharp phone in hand. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. Not yet. The room belonged to her. Or so she thought. The founder stood by the end of the table, arms folded, jaw tight. He didn't waste time. Where did the licensing failure come from? Becca blinked. We moved off Eliza's code months ago. This must be a confusion in tracking. Then Jonah spoke. Quiet, direct. No, we didn't move off it. We renamed her modules, wrapped new APIs around them. But the logic, the structure, the framework, it's all still hers. A long silence. Becca's voice tightened. That's not how IP works. We rewrote everything. Jonah shook his head. No. You didn't rebuild it, you reskinned it. Those 6 words cut sharper than any accusation. Because deep down, everyone in that room already knew. They just didn't want to admit it. The founder turned to Bryce from legal. "If this goes to court, what happens, Bryce?" Didn't flinch. "We lose. Fast. She has timestamps, logs, a registered license, and now public usage. It's enforceable." The air felt heavier after that, like everyone was breathing in liability. Becca tried to speak again, but no words came out. And finally, the founder said it. "This is a formal request for your resignation, effective immediately." She didn't argue, didn't cry, just nodded. And for the first time in months, I imagine she understood she'd never actually built anything. She'd just stood on top of what someone else made, slapped on a filter, and smiled for investors. And when that filter cracked, the truth came pouring through. But there was still one message left to be sent, and it wasn't coming from Becca. 3 weeks after the board meeting, I received an email. Subject line, "Open to renegotiation," from the board at PulsePoint AI. The tone was formal, but the subtext was clear. They were cornered, humbled, and finally ready to talk like adults. They wanted to explore a mutually beneficial agreement for continued use of my IP. They used phrases like collaboration, moving forward, and shared vision. But what they were really asking was simple, how much is it going to cost to keep this running? I didn't respond right away. I was at a quiet cabin in Taos, sitting on the porch, drinking coffee that actually stayed warm. My laptop rested on the railing. I'd already opened the licensing dashboard, just hadn't clicked submit. Inside the portal, I adjusted one field. Per user pricing enabled. retroactive fees applicable. Click. Saved. And then I closed the lid. No celebration, no press release, no need to post anything snarky on LinkedIn. Because this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about remembering that what you build in silence, in struggle, in the hours no one sees, has value. Even if they forget. Even if they try to erase you. Even if someone louder walks in and takes credit for what you quietly carried for years, you don't need to shout to be powerful. You need documentation, and clarity, and a well-written clause at the bottom of a contract. I didn't burn anything down. I didn't yell. I just made sure I still held the keys even when they stopped seeing the door. And that, in the end, was enough. Real power doesn't need to be loud. It just needs to be licensed. Now I'm curious, what would you have done in my place? Or better yet, have you ever been replaced but not really gone? Tell me your story. Someone out there might need to hear it.